is 216 BC, and Hannibal Barca has just executed one of the most brilliant military maneuvers in history. His army surrounded a Roman force twice its size and was closing in for the final strike. Among the chaos, a young military tribune, Scipio the Younger, refused to accept defeat. Fighting through the encirclement, he escaped with a handful of soldiers and fled toward the town of Canusium. Behind him, the screams of fallen Romans echoed as the massacre began. As he rode, Scipio tried to make sense of what had happened. Rome had outnumbered Hannibal 2-1. It was the largest army they had ever gathered, and yet they still lost. When the survivors reached Canusium, they camped in silence, weighed down by despair. Rumors spread that Rome itself might soon fall. Some even spoke of abandoning Italy to seek service under another king. To Scipio, these words were intolerable. He stood and declared, "You are worse than cowards. You are traitors. Swear your loyalty to Rome now, or I will kill you with my own hands." The soldiers' fear, however, was not without reason. Hannibal was only 5 days from Rome. In panic, the Republic scrambled to raise a new army. Boys barely past childhood were drafted. The wealthy were ordered to hand over their slaves, who were then equipped with old enemy weapons taken as trophies. This untrained force was stationed on the city walls alongside the survivors of Cannae, bracing for Hannibal's arrival. But Hannibal never came. Unlike the Romans, who often sought total destruction, Hannibal's goals were less absolute. He wanted Rome reduced to a regional power. Believing Rome would surrender after Cannae, he sent a messenger to negotiate peace. The Romans, however, refused to even grant an audience. Frustrated, Hannibal threatened to execute hostages taken at Cannae. Roman senators still refused to negotiate, passing a law that forbade paying ransom for prisoners. Eventually, Hannibal sold the captives into slavery. Yet his plan was working. Many Italian cities turned against Rome and allied with him. Against any other nation, Hannibal would have already claimed victory. But Rome was different. Refusing to surrender, they raised another army and resumed the Fabian strategy, avoiding direct battle and targeting Hannibal's allies. This created new problems for Hannibal. The cities that had joined him now expected his protection, but he could not be everywhere at once. Meanwhile, Rome expanded the war into Carthaginian territories abroad. After recovering from wounds at Ticinus, Scipio the Elder joined his brother, Gnaeus, in Spain. Together they captured key regions in the north, cutting off Hannibal's reinforcements and supplies. By 215 BC, Hannibal's army was weakening under constant pressure. His brother Hasdrubal, in charge of Spain, realized he must defeat the Scipios before sending aid to Italy. He marched north and confronted them near the town of Dertosa. Both sides prepared for battle in familiar formations. The Romans placed heavy infantry in the center, flanked by cavalry. Hasdrubal countered with Iberian troops in the center, African heavy infantry on the sides, and cavalry on the wings, mirroring Hannibal's strategy at Cannae. Confidently, Hasdrubal gave the signal to advance. The Roman heavy infantry struck the Iberian line, pushing it into a deep curve. Just as at Cannae, the trap was set. Hasdrubal ordered his African infantry to surround the Romans, but the Iberians collapsed too quickly. Unlike Hannibal's disciplined troops at Cannae, these warriors panicked and fled. Sensing their chance, the Romans broke through. Instead of pursuing the fleeing Iberians, they turned outward and struck the Carthaginian heavy infantry from behind. Morale surged as they cut down Hasdrubal's strongest soldiers, forcing him to retreat. Following the Battle of Ibera, the Scipio brothers advanced south and retook Saguntum, the very city that had ignited the war. Their success in Spain grew steadily, and by 201 BC they had shifted the balance of power in the region. In response, Carthage sent Mago, Hannibal's other brother, along with a general named Hazer Bulgiso, whose name combined two of the most common Carthaginian names, to assist Hasdrubal against the Scipios. The three commanders led their forces separately. To the Scipios, this was the ideal chance to secure Spain entirely for Rome. The brothers recruited 20,000 additional Iberian mercenaries, raising their strength to 50,000 men. Confident in their numbers, they prepared to face all three Carthaginian leaders. Scipio the Elder took 2/3 of the army against Mago and Gisco, while Nias commanded the remaining troops to directly challenge Hasdrubal. Nias was the first to locate his opponent and quickly established camp, certain of victory. Yet Hasdrubal recognized that the Iberian mercenaries were loyal only to gold. The night before the battle, he bribed them to desert, leaving Nias with a weakened force that stood little chance. At the same time, Scipio the Elder was trapped by Iberians and the forces of the Numidian prince Massinissa, longtime allies of Carthage. In desperation, Scipio launched an early morning assault, but was ultimately defeated and killed when Massinissa arrived with reinforcements. Days later, Nias attempted to escape under the cover of night, but his army was pursued and he too was killed. With both brothers dead, Rome lost nearly all the gains it had made in Spain. After 7 years of resistance, Hasdrubal was now free to prepare for his march to Italy and to support his brother's campaign. He began organizing for a dangerous crossing of the Alps. News of the Scipio brothers' deaths soon reached Rome. Scipio the Younger was devastated. His father and uncle had now become casualties of the war with Carthage, and grief turned into an unyielding desire for vengeance. The Senate called for volunteers to continue the Spanish campaign, but only Scipio the Younger stepped forward. At just 24, he was below the legal age for command, yet he insisted on the appointment. Unlike other Roman generals seeking fame, his mission was deeply personal. The Barcid family had not only humbled Rome, but had also destroyed his own family, and he was determined to hold them accountable. With no better option, the Senate appointed him proconsul, granting him authority to lead the campaign in Spain. Scipio the Younger had already spent much of his life in war against Carthage. He had rescued his father at Ticinus and survived Cannae. Still, Rome continued to struggle, as Hannibal always seemed one step ahead. Scipio realized the Roman way of fighting would not succeed. If Rome was to win, it needed to adapt. "We must learn to fight as the Africans fight," he declared. Arriving in Spain in late 210 BC, Scipio spent the winter drilling his troops in new formations designed to counter Hannibal's strategies. He waited patiently for the right moment to act, which came in 209 BC. Knowing he could not defeat all three generals at once, he relied on speed and precision. When Hasdrubal and Gisco were occupied suppressing uprisings in western Spain, Scipio advanced quickly toward New Carthage, the capital of Carthaginian Spain. The city, thought to be impregnable with water on 3 sides, fell to the Romans in just 1 day. Inside New Carthage, Scipio released hostages that the Carthaginians had used to control local tribes. This act won him widespread support. Just as Hannibal had been seen as a liberator in northern Italy, many Iberian tribes now saw Scipio and the Romans as allies, and they rallied to his side. The following year, Scipio marched against Hasdrubal, who had fortified a camp on a well-defended hill. As the Romans approached, Hasdrubal placed his javelin throwers and slingers on the first plateau and kept his heavy infantry positioned higher, on the second. Fearing Carthaginian reinforcements, Scipio ordered a swift attack. His skirmishers charged uphill, immediately met with stones and javelins. Despite heavy losses, they pushed forward and captured the first plateau, overwhelming Hasdrubal's light troops. As the Carthaginians focused on the front, Scipio secretly divided his army, sending half to flank the hill from the left and his, General Laelius, with the rest on the right. Unaware of this maneuver, Hasdrubal confidently began deploying his main army to meet what he believed was the full Roman force in front of him. Scipio and Laius had climbed the hill unnoticed and struck Hasdrubal's army from both sides, a maneuver that would later define Scipio's style. Nearly surrounded, Hasdrubal pulled his elite soldiers from camp and withdrew down the hill. He managed to escape only because the Romans turned to looting his supplies instead of pursuing him. Realizing the war was shifting, Carthage ordered Hasdrubal to cross the Alps and join Hannibal in Italy as quickly as possible. They hoped 2 Barcas in Italy might finally end the conflict. In 207 BC, Hasdrubal led 30,000 men across the same Alpine route Hannibal had taken 11 years earlier. He successfully reached Italy and sent a messenger to arrange a meeting point with his brother. But this proved his final mistake. The messenger was captured, and the Romans learned his route. Both consuls moved their armies to block him near the Metaurus River. Hasdrubal's exhausted army was forced into battle and completely destroyed. Seeing the defeat of his men, Hasdrubal gathered the last of his soldiers and personally charged into the Roman front line. Days later, as Hannibal waited impatiently for news of his brother, Roman riders arrived at his camp and hurled Hasdrubal's severed head over the wall. Looking down, Hannibal quietly remarked, "There lies the fate of Carthage." By 206 BC, the Carthaginians in Spain were suffering repeated losses against Scipio the Younger. Mago and Hasdrubal found themselves cornered as more Iberian tribes abandoned Carthage and sided with Rome. To halt this seemingly unstoppable Roman commander, Mago and Gisco combined forces, raising an army of 74,000 men. They now greatly outnumbered the Romans and sought a decisive confrontation. That spring, the two armies met near the town of Ilipa. Both sides prepared for what would be the decisive battle for Spain. At dawn, Scipio arranged his men in the traditional Roman formation, heavy infantry in the center, Spanish allies on the flanks, and cavalry on the wings. Observing this, Mago and Gisco mirrored the layout with their larger army, confident of victory. The two armies faced each other for an entire day without engaging. The same happened the next morning, and soon the Carthaginians stopped carefully studying Roman positions before forming their lines. This was precisely what Scipio had anticipated. Before sunrise, he woke his troops and prepared for battle. His cavalry launched a surprise raid on the Carthaginian camp, forcing Mago and Gisco to hastily assemble their weary men. But to their shock, Scipio had altered his formation. His strongest units now faced their weakest Iberian allies, while light infantry opposed the war elephants. Meanwhile, Scipio's Spanish allies, his weakest troops, stood against the Carthaginian elite. The Romans advanced, and when the Carthaginians tried to react, it was too late. As the Roman heavy infantry approached, Scipio gave the signal. They suddenly spread outward, extending the Roman line and encircling the enemy's weakest troops. Philetas rushed forward, blasting horns and hurling javelins to panic the elephants, which turned and trampled their own ranks. On the wings, Roman legionaries overwhelmed Gisco's Spanish allies, causing chaos and collapse. Scipio had ordered his weaker Iberian center to advance slowly, keeping Gisco's best troops pinned in place. Afraid of being attacked if they moved, they stood frozen as their allies were destroyed around them. One wing broke, then the other. Roman cavalry and elite infantry pressed inward until Gisco ordered a retreat. The Carthaginians lost more than 48,000 men at Ilipa, a battle later regarded as Scipio's masterpiece. Mago and Gisco eventually abandoned Spain, leaving control of the peninsula and its vital silver mines and manpower to Rome. In only 4 years, Scipio had undone decades of Carthaginian effort, yet his campaign was not over. One final Barca remained Hannibal, and Scipio intended to face him on his own ground. Returning to Rome as a celebrated victor, Scipio, only 30 years old, was elected consul in 205 BC. His victories had also impressed the Numidian king Massinissa, a former ally of the Barcas. Convinced Rome would prevail under Scipio's command, Massinissa switched sides, providing the Romans with their first access to elite Numidian cavalry. When asked about his plans as consul, Scipio was direct. He wanted to invade Africa and strike Carthage itself. Many senators, especially Fabius Maximus, opposed the idea, arguing Hannibal was already weakening. But Scipio remained firm. This was the quickest way to end the war and secure victory. The Senate reluctantly gave him command of Sicily, knowing he would likely pursue his plan regardless. In Sicily, Scipio raised a volunteer force. The news spread, and the disgraced survivors of Cannae, branded as cowards and excluded from Roman society, saw a final chance to restore their honor. They flocked to his banner, and within a year Scipio had trained an army of 30,000. By 204 BC, the stage was set. Scipio begins his campaign by landing in Africa. where his forces are quickly joined by Massinissa and his men. Together, they establish camp just 25 miles from Carthage and immediately lay siege to the port city of Utica. Scipio's arrival throws Carthage into panic, and they order Hasdrubal and their Numidian ally Syphax to face the Romans. Syphax sets up camp and tries to negotiate peace as a neutral party, inviting the Romans to his camp. Scipio uses these talks as a chance to study the enemy closely. His spies record every exit point and note that the camps are built entirely from flammable wood. This information sparks an idea. In the middle of the night, Scipio sends Massinissa and his men to Syphax's camp, where they set the wooden huts ablaze. The dry wood and strong winds spread the flames quickly, engulfing the camp. The Numidians, believing the fire to be accidental, rush to escape without weapons or armor. But outside the camp, Massinissa and his troops wait fully armed. At his signal, the attack begins. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians, alarmed by the fire, rush to help with supplies only to find Scipio and his men waiting. The Romans set their camp on fire too and strike down everyone attempting to flee. In the chaos, survivors of Cannae are overwhelmed with emotion. Their long-awaited revenge finally arrives, and they unleash their fury without mercy. Though Hasdrubal, Gisco, and Syphax escape, Scipio manages to destroy nearly 50,000 men in a single night. Carthage quickly raises another force of 30,000 and faces Scipio in open battle during the day, but once again he crushes them using his trademark tactic, the Scipio sandwich. Afterward, Massinissa captures Syphax and becomes king of all the Numidians. With few options left, Carthage recalls Hannibal. Hannibal is devastated by the order. Leaving Italy means abandoning all he worked for over the last 15 years. He had come close to defeating Rome, but now, despite his brilliance, Carthage faces collapse. Without his homeland, there is nothing left to fight for. Quietly, he gathers his men and sails home. In 203 BC, Hannibal steps onto African soil for the first time in 34 years. Having grown up in Spain and fought most of his life in Italy, his homeland feels strangely unfamiliar. Instead of returning to the city, he sets up camp outside Carthage. The Senate gives him every soldier and war elephant they can muster. Hannibal leads this force out to meet Scipio in one last decisive battle. The two greatest generals of their age now prepare to face each other on the plains near Zama. Before the clash, Hannibal and Scipio ride out with their interpreters to speak face-to-face for the first time. Hannibal, now 45, looks at his much younger opponent and warns him, "Fortune is unpredictable." 10 years ago, he brought Rome to its knees, but now he stands as an old man asking for peace. He cautions Scipio that what fortune has done to him, she may do to Rome tomorrow. He urges peace, telling Scipio to accept his victory and return home a hero. Scipio refuses. The stage is set for one of history's greatest battles, the legendary champion of Carthage against Rome's undefeated commander, with the fate of the ancient world at stake. Hannibal places 80 war elephants on his front line. Behind them, he forms 3 infantry lines: Celtic allies and Italian mercenaries in the first, newly recruited Carthaginians in the second, and his elite veterans of 15 years in the third. His cavalry, though limited, guards the flanks. Scipio studies the formation and arranges his army in the traditional Roman structure. Inexperienced troops in front, veterans in the rear. But he makes one critical adjustment. His lines are positioned in columns hidden by skirmishers to appear as a solid wall. On one wing, he places Massinissa with his Numidian cavalry, and on the other, his Roman cavalry. With preparations complete, the battle begins as cavalry from both sides charge forward and clash. As in earlier battles, the Numidian horsemen prove superior, but this time they fight for Rome. The Carthaginian cavalry is quickly forced back. Hannibal responds by sending his war elephants forward, shaking the earth as they advance. But just as they reach the Roman front line, Scipio's skirmishers fall back, exposing open channels between Roman infantry formations. The elephants, faced with the choice of charging into spears or entering the clear passages, choose the latter. Once inside, they are surrounded, bombarded with javelins, and unnerved by trumpets blaring around them. Panicked, some elephants turn and flee, crashing into the already struggling Carthaginian cavalry. The Roman and Numidian horsemen then drive the remaining Carthaginian cavalry from the field, leaving the outcome to be decided by infantry. Hannibal's Celtic allies slam into the Roman line, and fierce combat begins, with the battlefield quickly filling with blood and fallen bodies. Driven by hatred for Rome, the Celts initially succeed, forcing Scipio's first line back. Yet, under Scipio's leadership, the Romans regroup, and soon the Celts are overwhelmed. Hannibal sends in his second line, composed of new recruits from Carthage who push hard against the exhausted Romans. The Romans break, and Scipio commits his second line. The struggle continues for hours, with the Romans slowly gaining the advantage. Hannibal's recruits fight bravely, but their strength fades and he orders them to retreat. Scipio realizes Hannibal's plan. The Romans are being lured into the path of his elite veterans. Quickly, Scipio halts the pursuit, and both armies pause to recover before forming final battle lines. On Hannibal's side stand veterans undefeated for 15 years in Italy. Facing them are Roman survivors of Cannae, determined to redeem themselves at any cost. The generals give the order, and the last clash of the Second Punic War begins. The fighting is brutal. Roman survivors fight with everything they have, but Hannibal's veterans hold strong, eventually pressing the Romans back. Seeing his troops falter, Scipio wonders if fortune had truly abandoned him, as Hannibal had warned. Then, on the horizon, he notices a dust cloud racing closer. Scipio smiles. Fortune had favored Rome. Massinissa and his Numidian cavalry return after routing their foes, striking Hannibal's rear line with devastating speed. Hannibal knew this risk, but time had run out. His army collapses. 20,000 men are killed, 20,000 more captured, while he barely escapes. On the battlefield, the survivors of Cannae finally celebrate, freed from 14 years of shame. With Hannibal defeated at Zama, Carthage sues for peace, ending the Second Punic War. Carthage is stripped of its territory outside the city, forbidden to wage war beyond Africa, and forced to destroy its warships before its citizens. Even conflicts in Africa would now require Roman approval. Additionally, they agree to pay Rome reparations for 50 years, a lasting symbol of their humiliation. Scipio returns to Rome in triumph. For defeating the Republic's greatest enemy, he receives the title Africanus. With Carthage subdued, Rome emerges as the dominant Mediterranean power. Its veteran armies soon turn against Macedonia and Greece, once great powers themselves. After the war, Hannibal enters politics but makes enemies by pushing anti-corruption reforms. Driven out of Carthage, he spends his life fleeing Roman spies. In 183 BC, at age 64, he is cornered in a small kingdom near the Black Sea. With no escape, he opens a hidden compartment in his ring, producing poison he had kept for this moment. Turning to his servant, he declares, "Let us relieve the Romans of their endless fear, for they find it too long to wait for the death of an old enemy." He drinks, ending his life. That same year, Scipio Africanus also dies in exile, accused of corruption by jealous Roman senators. On his tomb, he orders the words, "Ungrateful fatherland, you shall not have my bones." Though both men die in bitterness, the story does not end there. It becomes darker still. Carthage, though defeated, remains skilled in trade. Despite Rome's attempt to bury them in debt, they recover swiftly. Within a decade, they offer to repay their reparations early. Rome refuses, insisting the suffering last 50 years. Carthage complies and still pays off its debt with ease by 151 BC. Meanwhile, Massinissa, king of Numidia, expands into Carthaginian lands. Bound by treaty to seek Roman approval for war, Carthage appeals for help. In 153 BC, a Roman senator named Cato, an aged veteran of the Second Punic War, travels with a delegation, expecting to find a ruined state. Instead, he is shocked by a thriving, wealthy Carthage. Alarmed, he ends every speech in the Senate with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed." In one speech, he produces a large fig from his toga, announcing it came from Carthage only 3 days away. Senators are shaken. Some fear a wealthy Carthage could again raise an army. Others see fertile, prosperous land ripe for conquest. Cato's warning works, and the Senate resolves that Carthage must fall. Numidia's aggression gives them their chance. Rome refuses to mediate, and eventually Carthage raises an army to defend itself, breaking its treaty. This is the moment Rome had waited for. They declare war. The Carthaginians are stunned, having done everything Rome demanded. Hoping to negotiate, they offer concessions. Rome demands 300 noble children as hostages. When asked to guarantee their safety, Rome refuses. With no choice, Carthage surrenders its sons and daughters. Mothers cry out as their children are seized. Some cling to the soldiers' legs, others tear their hair in despair, while a few leap into the sea as the Roman ships sail away. Hopelessly swimming beside the departing ships, families watched with tears in their eyes as their loved ones vanished beyond the horizon. The sacrifice was immense, but saving Carthage seemed worth any cost. Yet the Romans were not finished. They demanded that the Carthaginians surrender all weapons and armor. Believing they had no choice, the Carthaginians handed over 200,000 suits of armor, catapults, and every weapon within the city. When their ambassadors asked if this was enough, the Romans stunned them by saying no. They declared that the Carthaginians must abandon the city itself and move 10 miles inland, away from the sea. The ambassadors protested, arguing this violated the treaty that guaranteed their right to keep Carthage. But the Romans insisted they had meant the people of Carthage, not the city. At that moment, the Carthaginians realized their trust in Rome had been a tragic mistake. The Romans had never sought peace. Their plan to destroy Carthage had long been decided. The Carthaginians had given up their children and their weapons for nothing. The ambassadors cried out to the gods, pleading with the Romans to reconsider, repeating that they had surrendered everything asked of them, but their pleas were ignored. Defeated, they returned to Carthage. When the Senate heard the news, chaos erupted. The shouts from the chamber reached the waiting crowds outside, who stormed into the building in rage. The senators who had urged surrendering the children were killed first, then those who supported giving up the weapons. Finally, the ambassadors themselves were dragged through the streets and stoned to death. With nothing left to lose, Carthage declared war on Rome. The city shifted into total war. Slaves were freed to join the army, and men and women worked without rest to forge weapons and armor. In desperation, women cut their hair to twist into ropes for new catapults. In 149 BC, Rome began its siege of Carthage. Against all odds, the defenders fought with remarkable strength and held the Romans back for 2 years. But in 147 BC, a consul with a familiar name rose to power and was sent to Africa to end the conflict. His name was Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted son of Scipio Africanus. Living up to his family's legacy, Scipio broke through Carthage's defenses within a year. He ordered the city's total destruction, and resistance was crushed in the streets. Out of 400,000 inhabitants, only 50,000 survived, and they were all sold into slavery. The once proud civilization of Carthage was erased from history. Roman soldiers marched through the ruins, setting the last buildings ablaze. From a distance, Scipio stood with the historian Polybius watching the city burn. When Polybius congratulated him, he was shocked to see the general weeping. Polybius asked why he cried after such a victory. Scipio replied, "It is a glorious moment, but I fear that one day the same fate will come to my own country." He then recited lines from the Iliad, where Hector foretells the destruction of Troy. "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall fall." Scipio knew that nothing lasts forever. One day, even Rome would join Carthage. As just another chapter in history, this will be the last video I narrate for some time. The next one will feature a different voice. I'll see you again in a few months.